Hey everybody, my name's Joe Pivarunas. I'm the founder and managing editor of Nanalyze. We're a boutique media and research firm covering disruptive tech companies for a broad audience of retail and institutional investors across the globe. Today we're going to talk about two solar stocks, Enphase and SolarEdge. The idea here is that we want to try to figure out which of these firms would make for the most compelling investment. And the way we usually go about doing that is by looking for red flags so we can quickly exclude companies that we believe are too risky. So we take a risk averse approach to tech investing. Tech investing is risky enough as it is, so managing that risk makes sense. Now, whenever we're looking at a theme like solar and we want to try to find out who the leaders are, because we always want to invest in leaders, the first thing we'll do is find a subject matter expert who can do all the work for us. So for solar, we went and looked at the only and biggest solar ETF out there, which is produced by Invesco, the ticker's TAN, and the underlying index for that ETF is the MAC Global Solar Index. And it's a passive index that ranks companies based on their exposure to solar. That's very important, passive exposure. So when you look at ARK Invest, they're an active manager. So they try to select which stocks they think will outperform and weight their indexes based on performance. While firms like MAC, that produces the Global Solar Index, they're simply interested in ranking stocks by size and exposure to solar. So we can look at their top 10 list. We did this in a recent piece. It's called the 10 biggest solar stocks. And I'll include a link to that research piece in the description of this video, along with the recent piece we published titled Enphase versus SolarEdge. So what we did is we took that top 10 list and then we removed stocks that we thought were too risky. There was a large California solar installation company. There was some Chinese firms that had variable interest entity structures, which we find to be too risky. It was a David and Goliath story that was competing against China. So we removed all the names that we thought were too risky to consider. And we were left with two names, Enphase and SolarEdge. Now, we know that these are two leading solar firms because they're also found in the top 5 companies for the iShares Global Clean Energy ETF, which looks at not only solar, but wind and utilities and stuff like that. So we can be pretty confident that we've picked two leaders. Now, what made these companies the leaders they are today are hardware products called solar inverters. And simply put, these convert direct current into alternating current. And you can see that Enphase and SolarEdge, they take two totally different approaches to how they handle inverters. And we're not going to get into that. So there's a big enough contingent of people out there who want to have a discussion around which technology is ultimately going to be Betamax and which will be VHS. And our cursory research shows that there's use cases that apply for both types of technology. So that's not a conversation that we're going to have today. We're going to look at what these companies do, where they get their money from, and both are growing like mad. So Enphase actually has, I believe, about 48% market share of U.S. residential solar over SolarEdge, which has about 40%. And Enphase generates 80% of their revenue from the U.S. market, while SolarEdge generates 40%. Now, any company that has the majority of its revenues tied to a single country, especially one where the legislation can change very quickly, solar is being subsidized through tax breaks and such, that's a risk. So we pulled this little clip here about the Renewable Energy and Job Creation Act of 2008 from Enphase's latest 10K, and it talks about how there's tax breaks available to people and institutions that put together solar energy systems based on the time that construction begins. And you can see how it's tiered. Actually, that second bullet point there should say December 31st, 2023, and it eventually goes to zero. So you would expect the demand for solar equipment to follow this reducing benefit over time. In other words, the demand will decrease over time. Well, there's uncertainty around that. So this could change the President Biden's administration, they're quite green, so maybe they're going to be passing some new bills that will benefit solar. And of course, solar stocks have taken a bump from what we've seen based on the current administration. So the takeaway here is that Enphase, with 80% of their revenues generated from the US market, is not appealing, whereas SolarEdge has 40%, which has been dropping over time. So the other thing we noted about Enphase was customer concentration risk. You can see here that that's been changing in quite an interesting manner. So 2019, they had 33% of total revenues tied to two customers. Then that went to one customer, 29% in 2020. And then in 2021, 34% of their revenues come from one customer. We're not given any color as to the customer's name or what type of customer that may be. The type matters. If it's a distributor, that's a far less concern than it would be if it's a company that consumes those products and may stop consuming them. In the case of distributors, you have customers on the other side of that distributor that are demanding your products. And usually if one distributors aren't suddenly just going to go under, whereas a large solar installer may run into troubles and suddenly 34% of your revenue goes away. Now, when we look at SolarEdge, this is quite interesting. 30.9% of their 2021 revenues came from what they call two distributors, a firm called Consolidated Electrical Distributors, which is what it says on the tin, and Sunrun. Some of you may be familiar with Sunrun. They merged with Vivint, and they're now the biggest residential solar installer in the United States. So these are actually, we wouldn't consider that to be a distributor. You know, you have Consolidated Electrical Distributors with 700 locations across the United States, one of the largest privately owned electrical distributors. And then you have the largest residential installer, which is Sunrun. And they're also doing things like financing and maintenance and all that. So these are two different customer profiles. We're not told the percentage each. We know that each contributes at least 10%. And then when you look at SolarEdge, the fact that 40% of the revenues come from the United States, they are very concentrated with these two customers in the United States. So when we look at SolarEdge's geographical diversification, as we mentioned earlier, you can see that their exposure to the US has been declining every year, at least for the past 3 years. It was 47% in 2019, 42% in 2020, and 40% in 2021. We want to see geographical diversification because a lot of these countries have changing requirements, and suddenly when some benefit evaporates or some benefit is given, we want to make sure that minimizes volatility to the overall revenue streams. So you can see here the breakdown for Sunrun, which is quite interesting, as opposed to Enphase, which is 80% in the US, as you can see here, with their international exposure is growing. I'm not sure if that's growing faster than the US. I can't do that mental math in my head, but what I wanted to point out here is another problem we have with both these firms, and that is when you're selling hardware products and solar systems, you have to have some recurring revenue stream that pays dividends down the road. In the same manner, you have Illumina, which sold a bunch of machines, and today 70% of the revenues are from consumables. You want to see high margin recurring revenue accompanying the sale of hardware products. Well, and this is difficult to tell because we're not told otherwise with both these firms, but you can see for Enphase, the point in time. So products delivered at a point in time, that's the vast majority of their revenue. And they say products and services delivered over time, that's what a recurring revenue stream would look like. And you can see they have almost no recurring revenue. Well, we're not quite sure because we're not told otherwise, but it appears that they don't have recurring revenues to accompany the hardware that they're selling. When we look at SolarEdge, we see they break down revenues by inverters, optimizers, and then this other category. Would that be the recurring revenue stream we're looking for? We're not told. So we just don't know. And the fact that these two firms don't really break this stuff out makes it difficult for us to see how they're performing. So both are dabbling in things like home batteries, and they'll say something like, well, our home battery sales increased 350% last year. Well, without a benchmark or a baseline, we have no idea what that looks like. So it's very difficult to tell where the money comes from once the demand for solar hardware starts to decrease. And as we talked about in that original article on 10 solar stocks, solar is expected to grow very strongly, even when compared to wind, and become the predominant renewable energy in the future. So we don't have to worry about demand diminishing probably anytime soon, but we certainly want to be thinking about how these firms are making money once they get past the boom of hardware product sales. Now, when we look at both firms in terms of our simple valuation ratio, Enphase is very richly priced. They're trading at twice the valuation, just using our ratio here, which is market capitalization divided by annualized revenues. It's quite simple. And you see Enphase is the richer of the two. And we certainly, after the research we performed today, or we talk about today, Enphase wouldn't be a firm that we would invest in. Now, when we look at past performance, it's certainly a firm we would have liked to be invested in. They had 11,000% return over the past 5 years, SolarEdge with 2,000. You compare that to about 275% for the one and only solar ETF out there, and just 135% for the NASDAQ. Now, we were certainly curious why these big returns for the largest companies, Enphase and SolarEdge are the two largest companies in the solar Invesco SolarEdge ETF. Why haven't returns translated more into the 275% that we see for the solar ETF? Well, you have to look at that stuff using back testing, and it's very difficult. And there isn't much of a point in looking at past performance because it's no indicator of future performance. So investors who are considering solar need to remember that. Just to conclude, Enphase isn't really our cup of tea based on the factors that we presented today. The heavy exposure to the U.S. is quite a big risk, as well as the customer concentration risk they have, and the fact that we can't see any recurring revenues. Now, SolarEdge also has some of these problems, and the question remains, is SolarEdge a compelling investment? Well, if you're willing to look past some of these red flags, then perhaps it is. We'd need more time to research that, and I think a separate piece will probably accomplish that. So we'll probably look at profiling SolarEdge in a coming article, see if it's something that we would be willing to invest in or not. And if you have any questions regarding what we presented today, any comments, please just put them on the video. We'll respond to them there. We'll put in the research piece that accompanied this presentation in the description as well. And thank you very much for your time. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels. We'll be putting out new videos in the future.